This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
I'm very happy to be speaking to you on this very lovely morning. Let's hope it really is the beginning of spring, even though the wind is very cold. It was just so lovely walking out around the garden, looking at the daffodils and in the bright sunlight, and just feeling just so grateful that I live in such a wonderful environment. And I was reflecting while I was walking of the first time I gave a talk on one of these big events, and that was in 1978, I think. Or was it maybe a bit later than that? It was after I'd come back from India, I think. And Sangharakshita Bhante had, it was his idea to have these big weekends for men. It's a long, long tradition. We used to call them men's events. He called them events. He didn't want to call them retreats. He wanted them to be events where something would happen, an event. Like a sort of happening. We do lots of things together. You get lots of Buddhists together and people interested in Buddhism, and in a place on a weekend, and something would happen. And the talk I gave, because I'd just been to India, it was called "The Missionary versus the Dharmadutta." The missionary versus the Dharmadutta. The missionary versus the messenger of the Dharma. There was a deliberate sort of what's the difference between a missionary and somebody who brings the message of the Dharma? And obviously Bhante wanted to hear a bit about my experience in India. Unfortunately, as is often my habit, I went on far too long. The talk was only supposed to be 20 minutes. It was part of another talk. And Lokamitra, my dear friend, he can speak for quite a long time as well. He was before me. He went well over time. I was going well over time. And Bhante, Sangharakshita, kept saying to me in my talk, "I really think you need to finish now." I really think you... And I, instead of just, graciously and gracefully rounding it off, I just speeded up. And it went on and on. And the next day I apologised to him, and he said, it's interesting, isn't it? The people who speak the longest are those who've been to India. Lokamitra, you and me. I wasn't sure if it was a joke or if it a little bit of a ticking off. So anyway, we're part of a long tradition of these gatherings, these events, these happenings. And it's so good that we're exploring mind reactive and creative, which is this wonderful representing of the Dharma. And I'm so glad the booklet's come out with that great photograph of Bhante on the back. I think that photograph in itself tells you what the early movement was like. Sometimes we read the early days of the movement from the perspective of a highly organised structure that we have now. It's a great mistake. I mean, it was a sort of shambolic affair back in the day, very sort of close, very together, really inspired, not like what we have now. I mean, actually, I've got no nostalgia. I think the movement's better than it's ever been. But you have to look at those times in a very, very different light. And that photograph, it says it all, I think. So it's great to have that book out. And I don't need to say anything about that booklet, because Bodhinaga brilliantly represented that material yesterday in a way that we can use now. I mean, bringing it together with other teachings of Bhante and the Dharma. So I don't need to do any of that. But I do want to refer to those verses that Bhante quotes from the Dhammapada, the first two verses that Bodhinaga really highlighted for us. And in both of those verses, the first two lines of each, whether it's to do with the mind that is impure, creating suffering, or the mind that is pure, creating happiness, the first verse is the same. So experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. The Pali is Mano Pubangama Dhamma, Mano Seta Mano Maya. Mano Pubangama Dhamma, Mano Seta Mano Maya. So the Dhammas is Bhante's translated as experiences. You could translate it as reality, phenomena. It's plural because it's indicating there's no sort of single essence when it comes to the Buddhist nature of things. Reality as dynamic, it's alive, it's never sort of fixed and unchanging. Bhante's translation of experience is good because it's addressing both the inner and the outer, so to speak. It's a very, very difficult term to translate. But the whole idea, of course, is that we are creating this reality. And the Pali words are very instructive. Mano Seta. Mind, it can be translated as preceded by mind. Seta. Seta means a chief. Even it's the name for a merchant in Pali. So the mind is the chief principle in creating things, the head man, if you like, in creating reality, in creating our life. Mano Pubanga means preceded by, so the mind precedes everything. Yes, so Mano Seta, the chief. And Mano Maya. Maya here means created. It's a word for art. Artistic creation is Maya. It's also the word for illusion. Very, very rich word. But the main force here is, the point here is that we create our reality. We create our experience. We create and recreate it. That's the main force. And mind, the nature of mind here, mano, manas, here is definitely not a sort of passive receptacle. It's cognate with chaitana here, which means more like will and volition. This is what is being got at here by mind. So it's our volitional actions, our body, speech and mind driven by our volition that creates our world, that creates our experience. In a later lecture, much later, a lecture series on a wonderful Mahayana Sutra called the Vimalakirti Nidesha, the exposition, the teaching, the instruction of Vimalakirti, a wonderful series called The Inconceivable Liberation. Bhante is talking about the Bodhisattva ideal, and that what a Bodhisattva does is to create a Buddha Kshetra, a Buddha field. That's what Bodhisattvas do. Bodhisattvas being those great beings who are dedicated to the enlightenment of all beings. And what they do, what they're concerned with, is not just kind of going along to enlightenment and then saying, I love you all and, all that sort of. No, they're concerned to create worlds, environments, which are highly supportive to Dhamma practice. Their creativity is the creation of environment, the creation of world. And in that lecture, I think it's the first lecture in that series called Building the Buddha Land, he said sometimes, taking this word creative, sometimes we say, I'm a very creative person, or he's a very creative person. Sometimes we say rather sadly, I don't feel very creative. But his point is, in that lecture, is we're creating all the time. We're creating all the time because our mind, our manas, our chaitana is making. And the creation is either ugly, reactive mind, or it is beautiful, it is meaningful. This is a very, very powerful point that is being made right at the outset of the Dhammapada. You could say right at the outset of Buddhist tradition, that we are in charge. Our mind is in charge, is the chief. Our mind precedes everything, and we create everything. Of course, let's be mindful that we are highly conditioned and affected by external conditions. Buddhism, of course, understands that. Perhaps especially our early childhood and things like that has a huge effect upon us. Other people have a huge effect upon us. Our whole environment has an effect upon us. The political system has an effect. The economic realities have an effect. Weather, climate has an effect. Buddhism isn't sort of, it's not subjective in that way. But in terms of liberation, in terms of going forward, right now, as soon as there is the dawning of some real awareness, the only way forward is for us to get hold of our minds, to get hold of our consciousness, to get hold of our will, our volition, our heart, to take charge of that and to start recreating, start creating anew. And of course, in order to do that, we need very, very positive environments to support that. Hence, the Bodhisattvas creating Buddha fields, creating Buddha lands, creating environments which support that mind, that activity of consciousness, supporting the path to liberation. In the Bodhisattva tradition, in our own, the original, there's a meditation practice called the development of bodhicitta, because it's what's called the arising of the bodhicitta, the arising of the heart, which is completely determined on wisdom and compassion, and is the first sort of dawning of wisdom and compassion in consciousness, the bodhicitta. There's a practice that you take up where you set up the conditions for the arising of this bodhicitta. And in the practice that Sangharakshita was transmitted to him by his great Nyingma teacher, Khatchu Rinpoche, one of the great lamas of the 20th century, the beginning of that practice says, we need to make a new mind. We need to create a new mind. And the new mind arises from an entirely different relationship to the world around us. So I want to start, first of all, by talking about what this new mind, the new mind of a bodhisattva, might be. I can't tell it from personal experience. This is where delving into the scriptures is very helpful. The scriptures tell us what that new mind will be like. And I want to go to the Vimalakirti Nidesha. The Vimalakirti Nidesha is an absolutely wonderful sutra. And thankfully Bhante has made it accessible to some extent to us, provided a doorway into this amazingly profound and cosmic sutra. In that sutra, there is this great bodhisattva named Vimalakirti, a householder who lives in the great city of Vaishali. Out of his skillful means, out of his compassionate, skillful means in order to communicate the Dharma to people, he manifests sickness. He becomes sick. Actually, I think he really becomes sick. But anything that a bodhisattva does is a way of connecting with life. And when a great man is sick in India, people will go and visit them. They'll go and stay outside the house for days and days and days in order to just make sure they're okay and be around them. He's sick. And there's a whole story of the Buddha trying to send different bodhisattvas and disciples to console him in his sickness and inquire after him. And they're very reluctant to go because Vimalakirti is an extraordinary character who, if you encounter him, you're likely to get a real dose of reality that is very, very shocking and humiliating to experience. So even when he's sick, people are very wary. They're very, very scared. Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, says he'll go. He'll go with the grace and the blessing of the Buddha. He said, only with that will I be able to withstand Vimalakirti's eloquence. It's amazing what happens. So Manjushri starts going towards Vimalakirti, and Vimalakirti says, oh, Manjushri is coming. So he just dissolves his whole house into emptiness. Even the doorkeeper dissolves into emptiness. So Vimalakirti is sort of floating on a couch in space, and with Manjushri coming, and they have a real metaphysical ding-dong. But then Manjushri asks him where his sickness comes from. And Vimalakirti says, Manjushri, my sickness, my affliction, comes from ignorance and craving for existence. And it will last as long as the sickness of all living beings. Were all living beings to be free from sickness, I also would not be sick. Why? Manjushri, for the Bodhisattva, the world consists only of living beings, and sickness is inherent in living in the world. Were all living beings free of sickness, the Bodhisattva also would be free of sickness. For example, Manjushri, when the only son of a merchant is sick, both his parents become sick on account of the sickness of their son. And the parents will suffer as long as that only son does not recover from his sickness. Just so Manjushri, the Bodhisattva loves all beings as if each were his only child. He becomes sick when they are sick and is cured when they are cured. You ask me, Manjushri, whence comes my sickness? The sicknesses of the Bodhisattvas arise from great compassion. Extraordinary passage, one of the most profound in Mahayana Buddhism, in the whole of Buddhism. But it's this line that I particularly love. For the Bodhisattva, the world consists only of living beings. For the Bodhisattva, the world consists only of living beings. The new mind that you develop in order to become a Bodhisattva is to recognize fully and completely that the world consists only of living beings as you are a living being. You know, we have to interrogate what is our attitude to the world, what is our attitude to other people, to other living beings. So often it can be that they're just things, really, on the sort of edge and periphery of our consciousness. Maybe one or two of them, or more than that, are very, very important to us. But so often others can just be a way of us gratifying ourselves, gratifying our own craving and attachment and pleasures. And then when we don't get that from them, we become indifferent to them or aversive to them. They're not living beings for us. They're not living beings for us. We turn living beings so often into an abstraction, and it's why the world is in such a state. You know, human beings, living beings, are just reduced to economic ciphers, political ciphers, consumer ciphers, and so on and so forth, algorithms. And we're very affected by that. You know, targets for political opinion. You know, even in the right-on circles, so to speak, right, left, wherever you look, the ideologies of the world, I don't think they really deal with living beings. Not really. Not living beings in the sense that Vimalakirti is talking about them. And I think it's one of the great things that we really need to wake up to as Buddhist practitioners, is that the world consists only of living beings. I remember years ago hearing a story of somebody going to Sangharakshita, and in the course of the conversation the person said to them, "Oh, I'm thinking of starting a relationship," meaning of course a sexual relationship. And Bhante said, "Well, who do you have someone in mind? Are you meeting someone?" "Oh no, I just want to start a relationship." And Bhante thought that was very strange, very sort of alienated, because it wasn't about another person. It was the idea of a relationship. It was the idea of something that you're going to get something. It's not really to do with other people, another living, breathing, moving person, another living presence. And that's so often what we do. Perhaps that's something to really go away and reflect upon and perhaps talk about in our group. Do we see the world as the Bodhisattvas do, as consisting only of living beings? So we need to develop this new mind. So how do we develop that new mind? There's all sorts of ways we develop that new mind. I'm going to turn to the great Shantideva, great Bodhisattva of the 8th century in his great manual of Bodhisattva practice, the Bodhicharyavatara, the entry into the way of enlightenment, the way of the Bodhisattva, which is one of the great classics of Buddhist tradition and one of the important texts for us in our movement. It was the first text that Sangharakshita did a seminar on for us. And in that book, that great book, there's a section called Dhyana Paramita, the perfection of meditation. The perfection of meditation. There's so much interest in meditation, and the idea, yes, of the perfection of meditation, Dhyana Paramita, Bodhisattva meditation. That's very exciting. You know, what sort of wonderful mystical states are going to be described. And it's very interesting to look at the arc of Shantideva's meditation instruction in Dhyana Paramita. He starts in the classical way by indicating what are known as Kaya and Chitta Viveka. The withdrawal. Viveka here means something like withdrawal or seclusion. Kaya Viveka means you go away from the usual distractions. You leave your regular life. Yes, you go away from your electronic gadgetry. You go away on a retreat. You go into the countryside. You go away from the usual things that distract you and so on. It's one of the reasons why we're so keen on reducing input on these retreats in terms of what we bring here. And on a meditation retreat, that would be even stronger with lots of silence and so on. So you're disengaging. You're disengaging in order to change your relationship with the world around you. Shantideva evokes beautifully the sort of countryside that you would retreat into, the rock caves, the jungles, the roots of trees, you know, the wonderful natural world. There's a wonderful aesthetic quality to his evocation of that, which of course has a soothing effect on consciousness. And then he teaches a very, very tough meditation that we don't do, called the Ashubha Bhavana, the contemplation of the ugliness of the body. I don't want to go into that too much. But this is to purify the mind. It's to create chitta viveka, the seclusion of the mind from craving, from attachment. In other words, to withdraw from that usual way of seeing other people in terms of attachment and grasping and aversion, turning living beings into things which you can get something from. That's what that meditation is really all about. It's very, very powerful. There's other ways you can do it. You can do it through meditation on death and impermanence and things like that. Then, having done that, he teaches the perfection of meditation in terms of a profound meditation practice called the realization of Paratma Samatha and Paratma Parivartana. Paratma Samatha means the realization of the sameness of self and all others. Paratma Parivartana means the realization, the full realization of the exchange of self and others. So I'm going to talk a bit about this, because really it's nothing other than a way of doing metta bhavana. That's what he's really talking about. You've purified your mind of the usual way you engage with people, then you concentrate on the positive. We do it the other way. We concentrate on the positive first, which I think is a very good thing with our metta bhavana practice. So Paratma Samatha is very, very simple, really. It's very, very simple practice. I think I probably talk about it on every great gathering, so because I think it's so important. But it's, first of all, you have to have this sense, of course, that you yourself are a living being. You know, sometimes we can forget that we are a living being. You know, we can be so busy sort of turning ourselves into a machine, you know, but with our technology and all the rest of it, that we forget that we are a living being, that we have the senses, we have our breath, we have our living beingness. Sometimes I think people struggle with the first stage of the metta bhavana because they just don't wake up sufficiently to the wonder of just being alive. I mean, it's lovely walking around the garden today, just to feel the cold wind and the bright sun on my face. Just simple sensations like that. It's just so wonderful to experience. But Shantideva goes a bit further than that. And he says, as living beings, we love life. You know, when you really wake up to being alive, you cherish your life. You want to feel well, you want to feel alive. You don't want to die. You don't want to be sick. You don't want to feel unsafe. You want to feel protected. You want to feel treated well. So out of this, of course, you can develop that sense of metta for yourself, as it were, in the first stage of the practice. You even want to fulfill yourself deeply, profoundly. That's really what you want to do. You start to recognise much more deeply what life is really for. And then in the other stages of the practice, you learn to realise that every single human being, every single living being is actually the same as you. You don't need to have any information about any other being in order to love them. You really don't need lots of information about somebody because we share the common living beingness. In the case of human beings, the same human beingness. So you reflect, well, in the same way that I do not want to suffer, and I want to be well, and I want to be happy, in the same way that I want to be alive, in the same way that I want to be protected, in the same way that I want to be fulfilled in my life, that person is exactly the same. They don't want to be treated badly. They don't want to feel unsafe. They don't want to feel uncherished, unloved. So Shantideva has this recurring refrain throughout his meditation: what is so special about me that I should just be concerned with my own happiness and not the happiness and welfare of others? What is so special about me? There's nothing special, actually, about any one of us. You could say perhaps we're all special. We're all special in the sense that we all want to be well. We all want to be happy. We all want to avoid suffering. We all want to be, in the end, deeply, profoundly fulfilled. So he says, in this way, start to have a sort of sense of the commonness of life, the sameness of all life. He says, in our body is made up of different parts, the head and the limbs and the trunk and so on. And if a part of our body is hurting, we go to it. We don't really regard it as sort of separated out. It's a part of us. So he said, why not identify with all living beings in the same way? It's all really one body. It's all part of the same body. One part suffers, all suffers. This is the sort of realization that he's getting at, that you have this sort of sense that, you're suffering, yes, you do suffer, but everybody else suffers, as in Vimanakirti and the sicknesses of all beings. But the main thing here is that we're learning to see other living beings really as living beings, all other living beings. With the exchange of self and other, we go even further. Shantideva teaches a meditation. He assumes the shunyata meditation of Buddhist tradition, that really, if we investigate, we won't find anywhere a real and separate self. There is just an ever-changing flow of conditions. Well, if that's the case, everybody's the same in that respect. So it's just arbitrary that you've identified with this particular human kit. Why not identify with him and her and them and that? Why not imaginatively identify with all of life? This is a very, very profound spiritual practice and realization. Very hard to describe, and a rare experience of that sense of your consciousness expanding so much that you identify with all of life around you. It's an enormously blissful experience, because You're putting down the burden of a restricted sense of yourself as you start to tremble with, to use the traditional Buddhist language, the anukampa, the trembling with all life around you. Shantideva says this is a very mysterious practice, but he says whoever quickly, swiftly wants to liberate self and other must practice the supreme mystery, the exchange of self and other. So this is the way the Bodhisattva develops their new mind. And at the end of the account of this meditation on Dhyana Paramita, Shantideva has this wonderful line. He says, after doing all sorts of self-exaltation and things like that, he says, but why say many things? Why say many things? The Buddha Shakyamuni did things for others. The spiritually immature, the fools, do things for themselves. Just look at the difference. Just look at the difference. Fools do things for themselves. Shakyamuni, the Buddha, lives for others. This is the way he ends his exhortation. So when you start developing that new mind, and you can start developing that new mind every day in your meditation. Every day there is some viveka, there is some seclusion, isn't there? Every day, if you're sitting down for meditation in your room, even if there are other people around, your eyes are closed, you're with yourself, you're turning away from all the different things you're doing. You're looking to disengage and just renounce your grip on the world around you with all its distractions. And when you start doing the metabhavana, you start developing that new mind, just developing that friendliness, slowly, gently, expanding your range of friendliness, turning that into selfless loving kindness day after day. The new mind is developing. It really is developing. So we are doing it, maybe not in that incredible way that Shantideva describes, but we're moving in that direction. And what happens when that new mind develops? The Bodhisattva wants to act. The Bodhisattva wants to do something. He wants to have real creativity, if you like, the supreme creativity. When we talk about reactive mind and creative mind, quite rightly, we're talking about dwelling in the gap, we're talking about changing the way we kind of roll with things and things like that. That's a good thing, but in some ways it's the lesser path. In some ways it's the lesser path. It's a start, it's a very important start, but in some ways it's the lesser path. And I think there's a lot of the lesser paths around in meditation circles in the West and probably in the East at the moment. Meditation is very often used to make us more comfortable in samsara. Good start, not bad, great, mindfulness and all the different things we're doing. But the scope, the range of what this really is so much further. What the Bodhisattva does is start to enter into the realm of courageous, fearless, heroic, warrior-like creativity. Because what he wants to do, his medium for creativity, if you like, is living beings. Because he knows what living beings really are. What a living being really is. What a living being, what a human being really is. What a human being really is actually a potential Buddha. That's the deepest nature of a human being, according to, and every living being. But let's just stay with human beings for the time being. That's what a bodhisattva sees. If a bodhisattva was in this room right now, if he was looking at us, he wouldn't be seeing us in the way that we see each other. He'd be looking around, he'd be checking you all out, seeing where's the potential. He'll be seeing all of the potential, but he might notice some perhaps have more going on or more alive than others, or maybe not. Maybe he just sees you're all the same with that incredible potential. The Buddha was like this. The Buddha would go into an assembly and what he'd see was where people were at in relation to Buddhahood, and he'd direct the teaching to them. And then there's these tremendous sort of awakenings. You haven't got a bodhisattva here today, so you're probably not going to wake up, but never mind. So that's what a human being really is. This isn't a sectarian point. It's not a sort of religious dogma point. It's to do with the very nature of what it means to be human. As human beings, we've been sort of thrown up, as it were, by evolution, by change. We have this wonderful ability of consciousness, this incredible quality of reflexive consciousness. It can get us into a lot of difficulties, but it's a wonderful thing to be able to reflect on experience. We're not just doomed to be trapped in our sense experience. We have this quality that can reflect so that we don't just react. We have an imagination that can think, actually, I could be different. And I could treat this person differently. And I could do something differently. We even have an imagination that can actually visualize, imagine, and take the great leap to see that we could actually be completely liberated as a Buddha. That we could actually be a bodhisattva. That we could actually do something with other people to make the world a very different place. That is our deep nature. And one of Sangharakshita's insights, because we have that deep nature, we actually have a will to change. We want to change deeply, profoundly, but it's going to have to be a different kind of change, a higher change, this kind of change that I'm indicating. If we resist that, things become very, very painful and very destructive. He even says in one lecture that, if we block the urge to grow, to expand that consciousness, it can even become sort of criminal and destructive. That's an incredible point. An incredible point. And it's a very interesting retreat I've just done. I mean, I hear a lot of life stories at Papaloka on our Going for Refuge retreats. I hear people telling me how they came to the Dharma. And it was very, very clear to me, particularly on this last retreat, that with some of these guys, wonderful guys, you'd never imagine it. You'd never imagine their past. You couldn't imagine it. These wonderful guys talking, that if they hadn't found the Dharma, they'd be dead. I mean, I'm really not exaggerating. That because they hadn't, it's almost as if there was something dying for expression that couldn't find expression. So it became very self-destructive and destructive of others. People badly need the Dharma. Sometimes, Buddhists, even within our own Sangha, you'd think, Buddhist teaching, the Dharma is some kind of luxury item. It's some sort of, luxury thing. And, the real activity is going to be environmental activism or political activism or this or that or the other, getting out there. I'm an activist because I'm a Buddhist, because I live this life, because I believe, I see that without the Dharma, the people are perishing, as the Buddha says. That is the thing that's fundamentally missing. Yes, let's work in all sorts of other areas. But if you don't address that deep nature in human beings, we will never do anything about this world, about this life. And I sometimes feel that, I know very well, it's not that I feel it, I know it. We haven't started yet as Buddhists. We haven't started to really comprehend the depth and scope of the vision that we have of what we can really do with life. It's going to take a long time for us to realise that. Hopefully, what we're doing will last and it will really do something. So we need to follow the Bodhisattva. What the Bodhisattva does, if you like, his creative material, if you like, it's a metaphor, is living beings. And what he wants to do is to create communities that will work together to build, yes, something like a Buddha field, a Buddha land, environments where you're supported in your living beingness. You're supported to live this Dharma life to the full. And the way he does that is through a practice called the Sangraha Vastus, which is sometimes translated as the elephants of conversion, the elements of conversion. The elements of conversion. Conversion isn't a very good word, I think, here. Another way of translating it is the means of unification. The way he brings living beings together to work together to create something in which people can come into to live a full life, a full human life, a full Dharma life. So these are fourfold. There's dana, generosity, priyavadita, loving speech, and artacharya, meaningful activity, and finally samanata, which means exemplification. And there's real creativity here. It's sort of fairly easy to have a creative mind. It's much more difficult if you're trying to create something, if you're trying to create environments with other people, because other people are, well, they're other people, and you can be, the greatest bodhisattva going, and other people are going to resist you. That's part of their glories, that they're going to resist you, they're going to work against you, and there's all sorts of forces out there that undermine you. But the bodhisattva is courageous. He doesn't care. He doesn't do it for the praise. He doesn't do it for the thank yous. He doesn't do it to avoid blame and criticism. He wants to create something. So first of all, there's dana, generosity. The bodhisattva gives. Sangharakshita is very fond of quoting Walt Whitman from Leaves of Grass. Behold, I do not give lectures and a little charity. When I give myself. The bodhisattva gives himself to others. Yes, there'll be all sorts of ways he'll do that. He'll give through friendship. He'll give through teaching the Dharma. He'll give through providing environments. And this is where working together with other people creates something. This incredible room has come from generosity. It's come from generosity. It's come from the inspiration of Sangharakshita and his disciples and the community here and people's financial generosity over the decades and the incredible heroic generosity of my beloved friend Aloka, who's still painting all these things, and more recently all these people who are adorning our walls with the Buddha tiles. Do check out the Buddha Tile project. You're all part of this room, and this is an incredible environment for practice. This is all dana. This is all the mutuality of generosity. And it's the same in your centres and in your groups. They haven't come from some great corporation. There isn't some Triratna International, where the money comes down from head office. There's none of that. It all comes from the generosity of people participating. So a bodhisattva inspires generosity, inspires that giving. And also there's wonderful personal generosity. Sangharakshita says a spiritual community, a sangha, people really working together for the Dharma, is characterised by the constant exchange of gifts, of presents for one another, all sorts of gifts to delight one another. He says giving actually is the expression of one's delight in the human presence of another. The human presence, the living beingness of another. That's what generosity really is. And then there's loving speech, priyavadita, loving speech. This word priya is a very, very strong word. It means loving, it means beloved. It is the kind of word that would be used in love language, romance language, that sort of language. But this is for everybody. Giving your full presence to someone, really taking them in, really feeling that living beingness and talking to them in a way that is clear and gentle and courteous and kindly and expressive of your realization of their potentiality and their living beingness, whatever is going on for them. Sometimes that loving speech, that kindly speech, yes, it might be a bit fierce. It might even be a bit critical, because sometimes we might need that. Not all the time, and only when it's really necessary. Sometimes, one has to receive a little bit of exhortation to put down those things that are preventing you from actually treating other people, as potential Buddhas. It's not going round, as Bhante said in the lecture, calling everybody darling and dear and things like that. I mean, it doesn't preclude that, I should think. And in the lecture, it gets quite amusing. He happened to be listening to a radio play, and he said, I heard an extract said, which went, I'm going to kill you right now, darling. So it's not that. But it's this loving communication. And then artacharya means living meaningfully, meaningful living. Arta means meaning, good, something like that. Meaningful living, according to the Bodhisattva ideal, the Buddhist tradition, is communicating the Dharma. Communicating the Dharma to people in all that you do, whether explicitly or implicitly, as it were. It doesn't mean that you just go around giving lectures to people about Buddhism at the drop of a hat. It's more that the Dharma is alive in your life. You've activated the Dharma in your life. You're living this path, this Bodhisattva path. You're aspiring, to live from this new mind. And that's starting to affect all of your communication with other people. But yes, it also means making sure that people really hear the Dharma, really hear what Buddhism has to say. It's a liberating teaching, Buddhism. It really is. The words of the Buddha and the great masters are actually liberating. I remember when I was having some real doubts about being, quotes, a Dharma teacher. I don't like that word, Dharma teacher. Sharing the Dharma so much because of how pathetic my Dharma practice was. I felt how pathetic my Dharma practice was. It was a real crisis for me because I was in having to do lots of public ordinations and private ordinations and all the other things, and lots of talks. This is my life. But I felt the depth of my experience. Well, what depth? It was so shallow. And it was a real crisis. And I went to Sangharakshita. I went to see him when he was living in Birmingham, and he couldn't, he couldn't see properly. He had that macular degeneration. I was sitting with him, and I explained, and suddenly there was incredible quality of attention. I mean, talk about dana and priyavadita in the quality of attention. He really took me in. It's one of the things I noticed about Sangharakshita. Whenever I was in difficulty, whenever I really needed something, rather than sort of mucking about and trying to show how wonderful, incredible I was to him, which never worked because he blanked me. But when I was in real sort of need, there was this quality of attention that I've never experienced with anybody. And he said, yes, of course, it would be better if you did have real depth. He didn't say, no, Padmavajra, really, you're a very deep person, full of insight. He said, it would be better if you had that. But of course, when you're communicating the Dharma to people, you don't tell people, you're not going to tell them that you've got insight. It's not going to make much difference to them whether you've got that. What you do is faithfully communicate the Dharma. That's what you do. He said, I've known people gain a real insight from a bad explanation of the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths, they heard that, it changed their life. He said, see yourself as I see myself. You're just a messenger for the Dharma. You're just a medium for the Dharma. It's not about you, in other words. It's about the Dharma. It's about people getting the Dharma. So people do need to hear the Dharma. This is why we need to study, why we need to practice, why we need to reflect, so that we can talk to people about the Dharma as the Dharma, that will be really alive for them. It was very, very moving conversation, which I've never forgotten. And in a way, that brings us to Samanatata. Samanatata means exemplification, embodying what you preach, practicing what you preach. There being no discrepancy between the way you communicate the Dharma and your reality. Well, there's a huge discrepancy in my case. There's a huge discrepancy in terms of holding up the Dharma and the reality of my actual experience. I'm very, very conscious of that. But that doesn't mean that one shouldn't communicate the Dharma in all of its range and scope, because who knows, there might be people out there more advanced than you who can really get that. And there's that wonderful story, isn't there, of Nagasena, from the Questions of Nagasena, who was teaching the Dharma to an illiterate woman. And Nagasena at the time wasn't a stream entrant. She heard his exposition of the Dharma, this incredible teacher, and she became a stream entrant on the spot. And he recognised, wow, she's a stream entrant. He was so inspired that him, not a stream entrant, could inspire somebody to become a stream entrant through the Dharma. He became an arahant on the spot. So, you might be way, way ahead of where you really are, but you never know. Amazing things might happen when the Dharma is invoked through, really good communication and with real faith and devotion in the Dharma. So exemplification doesn't mean exemplifying perfection. What you exemplify is your struggle. What you exemplify is your growth. And if you exemplify even just one little step on the path, Sangharakshita says, actually, you exemplify the whole path. Exemplification isn't the exemplification of a particular fixed state. There is no fixed state. The Bodhisattva path is endless. It's off the scale. There's absolutely no end to it. Thank goodness. You never arrive. You never come to the end of living beings. You'll never come to the end of what can be explored. You'll never come to the end of creativity. It never stops. Hurrah. And you exemplify that. You exemplify that movement, that step into the unknown, even though you're struggling to do it. Sometimes people ask me, why did you get involved so long? Why did you get involved so long ago when you were so young? And I said, what you could boil it down to is adventure. When I first went along and did the Sevenfold Puja, my first contact, there was the thrill of adventure. When you're 17, you still want an adventure. And that, I thought, this is an adventure. This is an adventure in the world, and there's going to be an adventure in consciousness. And this sense that there's no end to that. I wanted that adventure. So that's the creativity of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva wants to create a community through generosity, through loving speech, through communicating the Dharma, and through exemplifying that life, and no matter how imperfect that may be. And as I say, this is really, really, really challenging, really difficult stuff. Engaging with other people to bring them together to practice the Dharma in a world where there's all sorts of changing conditions. That is where the heroic creativity needs to happen. Because there's all sorts of forces that are against you, forces inside other people, forces outside of you. And you really have to be a hero and a warrior to do it. And I want to end with something a bit strange, perhaps. It's a poem. I thought, well, if you're having something on creativity, the creative mind, you need some art, don't you? In a sense, we have it all here. I mean, there was a whole other part of the talk that I wanted to go into about actually the range of a bodhisattva's way of communicating, or the way the Buddha talks about the way bodhisattvas do the Buddha work is infinite. I'm using words and syllables and ideas, but there are places in the universe, in the cosmos, where bodhisattvas, Buddhas teach entirely through perfumes. or through lights in the sky, or through Bodhi trees, or through the beautiful appearance of the Buddhas. In a way, we've got a bit of this here. That's all ways of doing the Buddha work. I'm very, very conscious there's so many people in this world that we're not reaching. That's not the fault of the Dharma. This is not the fault of Sangharakshita's teaching. It's not the fault in principle of Triratna. It's our lack of imagination. It's our lack of skillful means to reach and connect with so many different people. I really passionately believe that anybody can get the Dharma if we could just find the communication, the way to connect them. But we do need to be heroes. We do need to have courage to do this. So I want to end with a poem about a warrior. It's a poem by David Jones, who was born in 1895 and died in 1974. I love David Jones. He was a painter and a poet. He was a very, very unusual man. There's a wonderful biography that came out of him recently by Thomas Dilworth. And Jones lived through the horrors of the First World War. He was a Londoner, a South Londoner from Welsh family, and he wanted and needed a mythic context, so he became a Roman Catholic. But like Eric Gill, who was an early mentor of his and a very strange Roman Catholic, his own kind of Roman Catholic in some ways, and this whole sense of the myth of Britain, not in a nationalistic, jingoistic way, nothing like that, very conscious of all of he used to draw these great maps, the mythic kind of journeys into Britain of all the different sort of tribes, how composite we are as a country, and that's even more so now. We need a new kind of mythology, if you like, that charts all that, and an art that expresses all that in relation to the Dharma. But here, he's taking a story from, I think, the Arthurian cycle, or something like that, of the men of Britain, and don't take the word Britain in the nationalistic sense, it's the mythic sense, having to hunt the great hog. The great hog. And I'm seeing this then as the hog, who's like a kind of demon, the hog of ignorance in the land, in the great forest. And you'll see from this poem how beautiful the head of the hunt, the king, the Lord, is. There's a kind of tenderness in the writing, but there's also an ecstasy in the writing. And I'm ending this talk with this, trying with a view. It's a bit of an experiment, really, with a view to trying to evoke, well, that one day we need a description of the Bodhisattva with his knights, as it were, turning back the demons of ignorance with all the artistry of our own modern sensibility and the reality of our highly varied country and world. When the free and the bond, and mountain mares and the fettled horses, and fourpenny curs, and the hounds of status in the wide jewelled collars, when all the shining aria rode with the diademed leader, who directs the toil, whose face is furrowed with the weight of the enterprise, the lord of the conspicuous scars, whose visage is fouled with the hog spittle, whose cheeks are fretted with the grime of the hunt toil. If his forehead is radiant like the smooth hill in the lateral light, it is corrugated like the defences of the hill because of his care for the land and for the men of the land. If his eyes are narrowed for the stress of the hunt, and because of the hog they are moist for the ruin, and for love of the recumbent bodies that strew the ruin. If his embroidered habit is clearly from a palace wardrobe, it is mired and rent, and his bruised limbs gleam from between the rents. by reason of the excessive fury of his riding, when he rode to the close thicket, as though it were an open land. Indeed, was it he riding the forest ride, or was the tangled forest riding? For the thorns and flowers of the forest, and bright elm shoots and twisted tanglewood of stamen and stem, clung and meshed him and starred with variety, and the green tendrils gartered him, and the briery loops galloon him, with splinter, spike, and broken blossom, twining his royal needlework, and ruby petal points counter the countless points of his wounds, and from his lifted cranium, where the priced tresses, dragged with sweat stray his straight brow furrows, under the twisted to the numbered bones of his scarred feet, and from the saturated forelock of his maned mare to her streaming flanks, and in broken festoons for her quivering fetlocks, he was comparisoned in the flora of the woodlands of Britain, and like a stricken Newman of the woods he rode, with the trophies of the woods upon him, who rode for the healing of the woods, because of the hog.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.